The transport ship, Valkyrie's Edge, hummed through hyperspace, carrying 200 of the galaxy's finest soldiers toward the contested world of Kepler 442b. Inside the cramped quarters, beings from a dozen different species checked their weapons, reviewed tactical data, and tried to ignore the nervous energy that always preceded a drop into hostile territory. Sergeant Zexhai of the Thalorian Empire adjusted his plasma rifle for the 100th time, his 4 arms working in perfect coordination. The weapon was a masterpiece of modern military engineering, capable of punching through reinforced battle armor at 300 meters. Around him, his squad mates carried equally impressive hardware. Corporal Venn wielded a graviton disruptor that could collapse matter at the molecular level. Private Kalas had twin photon cannons that fired bursts of concentrated starlight. In the corner of the transport bay, almost forgotten among the alien warriors, sat an old human. His weathered face told stories of countless battles, and his gray beard was neatly trimmed despite their military situation. What drew everyone's attention, however, was not his appearance, but his weapon. Strapped to his hip was what appeared to be an ancient projectile weapon. It looked like something from a museum, with its worn metal finish and wooden grip. The cylinder held 6 chambers, and the barrel was barely longer than the human's hand. Compared to the sleek energy weapons surrounding him, it looked absolutely primitive. "Hey, human," Zexhai called out, his translator converting his clicking language into standard Galactic. "What museum did you rob to get that antique?" The human looked up slowly, his steel-gray eyes meeting the Thalorian's compound ones. "Name's Jake Morrison," he said in a calm voice. "And this here's my grandfather's Colt 45. Been in the family for over 200 years. The transport bay erupted in laughter. Even the normally stoic, crystalline soldiers let out their version of amusement, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Venn, the draconian corporal, nearly fell off his perch as his scaled body shook with mirth. "A chemical propulsion weapon," Kalas squeaked, his tentacles waving in disbelief. "What's next? Are you going to throw rocks at the enemy?" "Now that you mention it," Jake said, patting a small pouch on his belt, "I do carry a slingshot as backup." This only made the laughter worse. Several soldiers were now recording the conversation on their personal devices, already imagining the entertainment value back on their home worlds. The idea of a human bringing primitive weapons to fight the Kethmori predators was beyond absurd. Lieutenant Commander Thys, the mission's void elf leader, finally restored some order. Her pale blue skin seemed to glow as she accessed the mission briefing through her neural implant. "Enough," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived 50 combat drops. "We have more important things to discuss than the humans' interesting choice in armament." The holographic display activated, showing a 3-dimensional map of their target zone. Kepler 442b was a lush world with dense forests and rocky terrain, perfect for the ambush tactics favored by the Kethmori. These creatures were the galaxy's most feared predators, standing nearly 3 meters tall with chitinous armor that could deflect most energy weapons. Their razor-sharp claws could tear through battlesuits, and their pack-hunting tactics had claimed the lives of thousands of galactic peacekeepers. Intelligence reports indicate approximately 50 Kethmori have established a nest in the northern forest. Thys continued. "Our mission is simple. Eliminate the threat before they can reproduce. Kethmori queens can lay up to 1,000 eggs in a single cycle." Zexhai raised one of his primary arms. "Ma'am, what about the human? Shouldn't he be reassigned to supply duty or communications?" Jake spoke up before the commander could answer. "I appreciate the concern, son, but I've been fighting ugly critters since before your species learned to walk upright. I'll pull my weight." "With that relic?" Venn scoffed, gesturing at the revolver. "My sidearm has more stopping power than your primary weapon. Those Kethmori have armor that laughs at primitive projectiles. We'll see, Jake said simply, checking the cylinder of his weapon one more time before snapping it shut with a satisfying click. The conversation was interrupted by the ship's announcement system. All personnel, prepare for drop in T-minus 10 minutes. Check your gear and report to your assigned pods. As the soldiers began their final preparations, Jake stood and walked to his equipment locker. Besides the revolver, he carried a simple combat knife, a few grenades of human manufacture, and what looked like an antique rifle slung across his back. No energy shields, no powered armor, no advanced targeting systems. Just cloth and leather and metal that had been forged before most of the other species had achieved interstellar travel. Human, called out Specialist Reth, a purple-skinned nebuloid with 3 eyes. Are you sure you don't want to borrow some real equipment? I have a spare plasma pistol that could probably take down a small starship. Jake tipped his hat, which was another anachronism among the high-tech helmets. Kind of you to offer, but I'll stick with what I know. This old iron has never let me down. The drop pods were cramped metal coffins designed to deliver soldiers safely through hostile atmosphere and defensive fire. Jake strapped himself in next to HFY, who was still shaking his head in disbelief. You know, the Thalorian said as the countdown reached its final moments. I've served with humans before. Tough fighters, good instincts. But you're either the bravest or the most foolish human I've ever met. Little bit of both, probably, Jake admitted as the pod's engines fired and they began their screaming descent toward the planet's surface. The ride down was violent and nauseating, exactly as drop pod rides were supposed to be. When they finally crashed through the forest canopy and slammed into the ground, every soldier stumbled out ready for immediate combat. The air was thick with alien pollen and the smell of rotting vegetation. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear the distinctive chittering calls of Kethmori communication. Form up, Lieutenant Commander Thys ordered through their comm systems. 2 squads. Advance by bounds. Maintain visual contact and watch your crossfire zones. The forest was a nightmare of twisted trees and dense undergrowth. Visibility was limited to maybe 20 meters in any direction, and the canopy blocked most of the sun. Perfect hunting ground for the Kethmori, who preferred to attack from concealment and drag their prey back to the nest for slow consumption. Jake moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades in combat zones. While the other soldiers relied on their sensors and night vision equipment, he seemed to navigate by instinct, his head turning to track sounds and movements that their technology missed. Contact front, whispered Corporal Venn, raising his graviton disruptor. Through the undergrowth, dark shapes were moving with predatory purpose. The first Kethmori burst from cover without warning, its massive form moving faster than something that size had any right to move. It was a nightmare of black chitin and gleaming claws, standing tall enough to tear a human in half with a casual swipe. Venn fired first, his graviton beam striking the creature's center mass. The energy weapon, capable of disrupting matter at the quantum level, barely scorched the Kethmori's armor. The beast kept coming. HFY opened up with his plasma rifle, bright bolts of superheated matter splashing against the creature's hide like water. Kalas added his photon cannons to the barrage, filling the forest with deadly light. The Kethmori staggered but didn't fall, its armor deflecting or absorbing most of the energy. That's when 4 more predators burst from the undergrowth simultaneously, moving to flank the squad from multiple directions. The coordinated attack was exactly what made these creatures so deadly. While the soldiers focused on one threat, others closed in for the kill. "Spread out!" Thys shouted, but it was too late. The creatures were already among them, massive claws slashing at battlesuits and energy shields, failing under the kinetic impact. Private Yek screamed as razor talons punched through his armor, lifting him off the ground. Specialist Reth tried to bring his heavy weapons to bear, but a Kethmori was already inside his firing arc, too close for the big guns to track. In the chaos of claws and energy fire, nobody noticed the old human step forward with his antique weapon drawn. Jake's movements were deliberate and calm, like a man who had done this dance many times before. He raised the revolver, aimed carefully despite the chaos around him, and pulled the trigger. The sound was different from the high-tech weapons. Instead of the hum and crackle of energy discharge, there was just a sharp crack that cut through the forest noise like a whip. The bullet, a simple piece of lead and copper, struck the nearest Keth-Mori in what might have been its head. The creature's armored skull exploded like a ripe fruit. Before anyone could process what had happened, Jake was already moving. The revolver barked 4 more times in rapid succession, each shot placed with surgical precision. The massive predators, seemingly invulnerable to advanced energy weapons, dropped like stones as simple projectiles punched through their armor and destroyed whatever vital organs lay beneath. In less than 10 seconds, 5 Keth-Mori lay dead in the forest undergrowth, and the old human was calmly ejecting spent brass from his weapon's cylinder. The silence that followed was deafening. 200 of the galaxy's most advanced soldiers stood frozen, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Their energy weapons, their targeting systems, their powered armor, none of it had been effective against the creature's natural defenses. But 6 bullets from a weapon older than their civilizations had ended the fight before it really began. Jake reloaded his revolver with practiced efficiency, each bullet slotting into place with a soft click. "Well," he said, looking around at the shocked faces surrounding him, "I reckon we should probably get moving before their friends show up." Lieutenant Commander Thiss was the first to find her voice. "How?" she asked simply. "Kinetic energy," Jake explained, holstering his weapon. "Those fancy energy weapons of yours get absorbed or deflected by their armor. But Newton's laws still apply, even out here among the stars. Momentum equals mass times velocity, and this old Colt delivers plenty of both." Zexhai bent down to examine one of the fallen creatures, his 4 eyes studying the perfectly round hole punched through armor that had shrugged off plasma bolts. "The projectile completely penetrated the carapace," he said in amazement. "Clean entry and exit wounds." "Armor's designed to dissipate energy," Jake continued, checking his surroundings for more threats. "Spread the heat around, absorb the impact, but a fast-moving projectile with a small surface area? That's a different kind of problem entirely." Kalas was recording everything with his optical sensors, knowing that nobody back home would believe this without video evidence. "But sir," he said, "your weapon is so primitive. How could your people possibly know it would be effective?" Jake chuckled, a sound that somehow seemed perfectly at home in the alien forest. "Son, humans have been killing things with rocks and pointy sticks for about 1,000,000 years. Just because we learned to build starships doesn't mean we forgot the basics." The truth was starting to sink in for the assembled soldiers. They had been so focused on advanced technology, on energy weapons and exotic matter manipulation, that they had forgotten the fundamental principles of warfare. Sometimes the simplest solution was the most effective one. "Sir," Ven said respectfully, his earlier mockery completely forgotten, "perhaps you could provide tactical consultation for the remainder of the mission?" "Happy to help," Jake replied, already scanning the forest for their next move. "But first, we need to get moving. Keth-Mori hunt in packs, and the sound of gunfire travels pretty far in these woods." As if summoned by his words, the chittering calls of more predators echoed through the trees, growing closer with each passing second. The old human's demonstration had been impressive, but their mission was far from over. Lieutenant Commander Thiss activated her tactical display, showing the route to the Keth-Mori nest. 2 kilometers through dense forest," she announced. "Unknown number of hostiles between us and the objective." "Then we'd better get started," Jake said, checking his ammunition count. He had plenty of bullets, but something told him he was going to need every single one before this day was over. The forest grew darker as they pushed deeper into Kethmori territory. Ancient trees twisted overhead, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even the alien sun could barely penetrate to the ground level. Every shadow could hide a predator. Every sound could signal an ambush. The 200 elite soldiers moved like ghosts through the undergrowth, but they all knew they were being watched. Jake Morrison walked point alongside Lieutenant Commander Thiss, his weathered hand steady on the old revolver. Behind them, the attitudes of the galactic troops had shifted completely. Where once there had been mockery and dismissal, now there was respectful attention to every word the old human spoke. "Tell me about these bullets of yours," Zexhai whispered, his forearms keeping his plasma rifle ready while his compound eyes scanned for threats. "What makes them so effective against Kethmori armor?" Jake smiled grimly, his eyes never stopping their constant sweep of their surroundings. "It's all about physics, son. That armor of theirs is designed like modern body armor, meant to spread energy across a wide area. But a bullet concentrates all its force into a tiny point. Think of it like the difference between being hit with a pillow and being poked with a needle." Corporal Venn, the draconian who had been among the loudest critics, now listened intently. "But surely our plasma weapons generate more kinetic force than your primitive projectiles?" "More energy, maybe," Jake agreed, stepping carefully over a fallen log that could hide a dozen creatures. "But not more focused penetration. Your plasma bolt hits that armor and spreads out, trying to burn through from the surface. My bullet punches a hole straight through before the armor has time to react." Private Calas's tentacles writhed nervously as he processed this information. "How long has humanity known this would work against Kethmori armor?" "We didn't," Jake admitted. "But humans have been fighting armored enemies for thousands of years. Knights in metal suits, tank crews, you name it. Same basic principle applies whether it's steel plate or alien chitin." The conversation was cut short by a hand signal from one of the scouts. Through the dense vegetation ahead, they could see movement. Not the random motion of local wildlife, but the deliberate, coordinated movement of hunters setting up an ambush. Lieutenant Commander Thiss accessed her tactical display, counting at least 15 Kethmori positioned in a rough semicircle around their planned route. The creatures were larger than the ones they had encountered earlier, their armor plates darker and more heavily ridged. Mature hunters, not the juveniles they had fought before. "Standard flanking formation," she whispered into her comm. "Energy weapons teams, prepare suppressing fire, close combat specialists, ready for breach and clear." Jake held up a hand. "Ma'am, if I may suggest a different approach?" Thess looked at him questioningly. The human had proven his worth, but she still had trouble accepting tactical advice from someone carrying such primitive equipment. "These creatures hunt by overwhelming their prey with superior numbers and coordinated attacks," Jake explained quietly. "They're not expecting effective resistance from our weapons. If we can take out their formation leaders quickly, the rest might scatter instead of pressing the attack." "And how do you propose we identify the leaders?" Specialist Reth asked, his 3 purple eyes focused on the old human. Jake pointed toward a cluster of particularly large Kethmori positioned on a ridge overlooking their route. "Those big ones up high. Classic command position, good sight lines, protected flanks. Take them out first. And the others lose their coordination." Zexhai studied the terrain through his rifle's scope. "That's nearly 400 meters. Our energy weapons might not be accurate at that range in this vegetation." "Mine will be," Jake said simply, unslingling the antique rifle from his back. The weapon looked even more primitive than his revolver. It was clearly ancient, with a wooden stock worn smooth by generations of hands and a metal barrel that showed the patina of age. There was no electronic scope, no targeting computer, just simple iron sights that had been used by human marksmen for centuries. "Sir," Venn said carefully, With all due respect, that range is beyond what any projectile weapon should be capable of. Jake smiled as he checked the rifle's action, the bolt sliding smoothly despite the weapon's obvious age. Son, this here's a Winchester Model 70. My great-grandfather used it to put food on the table from distances that would make your fancy computers jealous. He reached into his ammunition pouch and withdrew bullets that looked impossibly large compared to modern military rounds. Each one was nearly the length of his thumb, with a pointed tip that gleamed like polished copper. 30-06, Jake explained, noting their confused expressions. 220-grain soft point. Been dropping big game for over 300 years, and I don't see why alien game should be any different. The old human found a stable shooting position against a fallen tree, the rifle settling into his shoulder like it belonged there. Through the iron sights, he could see the Keth Mori command group clearly, their massive forms outlined against the alien sky. Range estimation? He asked quietly. 375 meters, Thys confirmed, consulting her tactical display. Wind from the southeast at approximately 15 kilometers per hour. Jake made minute adjustments to his aim, compensating for factors that his companions couldn't even detect. His breathing slowed, his heartbeat steadied, and for a moment he seemed to become part of the forest itself. The rifle cracked like thunder, the sound echoing through the trees with the authority that made every soldier jump. Through their scopes and sensors, they watched as the largest Keth Mori commander simply collapsed. A massive hole punched through its armored torso. The other creatures immediately began chittering in alarm, their formation wavering as they lost their primary coordinator. Jake was already working the bolt, ejecting the spent brass and chambering another round. The second shot dropped another command creature, this one positioned on the left flank of the ambush. The remaining Keth Mori were now in full panic, their carefully planned attack dissolving into chaos as their leadership structure collapsed. Now, Jake said quietly, safing his rifle, hit them while they're confused. The Galactic troops didn't need to be told twice. Energy weapons blazed through the forest as they caught the Keth Mori in complete disarray. Without their leaders to coordinate the attack, the individual creatures fell back on simple predatory instincts, making them predictable targets for the advanced soldiers. The battle was over in minutes. What should have been a costly running fight through prepared positions became a rout, with the surviving Keth Mori fleeing deeper into the forest rather than pressing their attack. As the shooting died away, the soldiers gathered around Jake with expressions of amazement and newfound respect. The old human was calmly cleaning his rifle, running a small cloth through the barrel as if he had just finished target practice rather than a firefight. Incredible, breathed Kalas, his optical sensors still recording. 2 shots, 2 kills at nearly 400 meters with an unassisted projectile weapon. It's all about practice, Jake said modestly, reassembling his rifle with practiced efficiency. My grandfather taught me that every shot counts, so you'd better make sure it hits where you're aiming. Sergeant Zexhai approached cautiously, his earlier mockery completely forgotten. Sir, I owe you an apology. We all do. Your weapons may be ancient, but in skilled hands. No need for apologies, son, Jake interrupted. You folks have built some mighty impressive technology. It's just that sometimes the old ways work better for certain jobs. Lieutenant Commander Thais was studying her tactical display, plotting their route to the Keth Mori nest. We're still 2 kilometers from the objective, and intelligence suggests at least 30 more hostiles between us and the target. Then we'd better be smart about how we approach this, Jake said, checking his ammunition supply. He had plenty of rifle rounds, but his revolver was down to 24 cartridges. Against 30 or more Keth Mori, every shot would have to count. The soldiers resumed their advance, but their formation had changed. Instead of the standard galactic military doctrine, they were now moving in a pattern that maximized Jake's effectiveness with his primitive weapons. Energy weapons teams provided suppressing fire and area denial, while the old human picked off priority targets with surgical precision. They encountered 3 more ambushes during their advance, each one broken by Jake's long-range shooting. The Keth Mori, evolved to hunt prey armed with claws and teeth, had no effective counter for a marksman who could kill them from distances they couldn't even see clearly. "Sir," Specialist Reth asked during a brief rest stop, "how did humanity develop such effective projectile weapons if your species evolved on a world without heavily armored predators?" Jake took a sip from his water bottle, considering the question. "Well, son, humans have been fighting each other for a long time. When one side develops better armor, the other side develops better ways to punch through it. It's been going on for thousands of years." "An arms race," Theiss observed. "Your species was essentially testing your weapons against yourselves." "You could say that," Jake agreed. "Not proud of all the fighting, but it did teach us a few things about making holes in things that don't want holes made in them." Corporal Venn was examining one of Jake's spent bullet casings, turning the brass cylinder over in his scaled hands. "The metallurgy is impressive for such an ancient design. This alloy would be considered premium quality even by modern standards." "Humans take their ammunition seriously," Jake explained. "When your life depends on your equipment working perfectly every time, you don't cut corners on materials or manufacturing." As they prepared to move out again, a new sound echoed through the forest. It was deeper than the chittering calls they had been hearing, more resonant and somehow more threatening. Every soldier froze as the sound washed over them. "Queen," Thys whispered, her face pale beneath her blue skin. "That's the sound of a Keth Mori queen calling her brood." Jake listened carefully to the alien sound, his experienced ears picking up nuances that the others missed. "How big do these queens get?" "Twice the size of the hunters," Zexhai replied, his 4 arms trembling slightly. "Armor 3 times as thick, and they're smart. Really smart. Some reports suggest they can actually use tools." "And we're walking into her nest," Kalas added unnecessarily. Jake checked his weapons one more time, his movements calm and deliberate despite the growing tension around him. "Well then," he said quietly, "I guess we'd better make sure we're ready for whatever she throws at us." The old human's confidence was infectious. Despite facing an enemy that was larger, smarter, and better armored than anything they had encountered so far, the Galactic troops found themselves feeling optimistic about their chances. After all, they had Jake Morrison and his ancient weapons on their side. What they didn't know was that the Keth Mori Queen had been watching them through her brood's eyes, learning from each encounter. She had seen her hunters fall to the humans' primitive weapons, and she was already adapting her strategy. The final battle would test everything Jake had learned in a lifetime of warfare, and everything his weapons could deliver against an enemy, unlike anything humanity had ever faced. The forest ahead grew darker as they approached the nest, and somewhere in that darkness, an alien intelligence was preparing its deadliest trap. The Keth Mori nest rose before them like a nightmare carved from living stone. Twisted spires of hardened resin and organic matter reached toward the canopy, creating a structure that was part building, part organism. The air around it hummed with alien energy, and the ground itself seemed to pulse with malevolent life. Jake Morrison stood at the edge of the clearing, his weathered hand steady on his rifle as he studied the massive structure. Around him, 200 of the galaxy's finest soldiers prepared for what might be their final battle. The easy confidence they had felt after witnessing the old human's marksmanship was tempered now by the sheer alien wrongness of what they faced. "Motion sensors are going crazy," Lieutenant Commander Thys reported, her pale blue skin almost glowing in the eerie light that emanated from the nest. "I'm reading at least 50 individual signatures, maybe more. The structure is interfering with our scans." Sergeant Zexhai adjusted his plasma rifle's settings, his 4 arms moving with nervous precision. "Sir, the readings suggest most of them are larger than the hunters we've encountered." possibly breeding class or warrior caste. And the queen? Jake asked quietly, never taking his eyes off the nest's entrance. Center of the structure, approximately 200 meters in, Thys replied. But the path is a maze. Multiple levels, branching tunnels, perfect defensive positions. Jake nodded slowly, processing the tactical information. In his decades of combat experience, he had learned to read terrain like other people read books. The Kethmori had chosen their position perfectly, creating a killing ground that would channel attackers into prepared ambush points. "Ma'am," Corporal Venn said respectfully, "perhaps we should call for orbital bombardment? Level the entire structure?" "Negative," Thys replied. "Intelligence needs the Queen alive for interrogation. Too much we don't know about their breeding cycles and expansion patterns." Jake reached into his ammunition pouch and began counting cartridges. 36 rifle rounds, 18 for his revolver. Against 50 or more creatures in a fortified position, the mathematics were not encouraging. "Sir," Private Calas asked nervously, "do you think your weapons will be effective against the larger castes?" "Only one way to find out, son," Jake replied, checking the action on his Winchester for what might be the last time. "But I've got a few tricks left that might even the odds a bit." The old human reached into his pack and withdrew items that made the alien soldiers exchange puzzled glances. Hand grenades that looked like they belonged in a museum, pouches of black powder, and something that might have been dynamite if such primitive explosives still existed. "Human engineering," Jake explained, noting their confused expressions. "Sometimes the best solution is the simplest one." The assault began at dawn, alien sunlight filtering through the twisted canopy to cast eerie shadows across the battlefield. The galactic troops advanced in carefully coordinated waves, their energy weapons laying down suppressing fire, while engineering teams prepared to breach the nest's outer walls. The first surprise came when their advanced plasma cutters proved useless against the nest's construction material. The organic resin absorbed energy like a sponge, actually growing stronger when exposed to high-temperature weapons. "Kinetic charges," Thys ordered, falling back on more primitive breaching methods. Jake stepped forward with one of his ancient grenades. "Mind if I try something, ma'am?" The explosion that followed was different from anything the aliens had seen. Instead of the clean, controlled detonation of modern explosives, Jake's grenade produced a violent, chaotic blast that sent chunks of the nest wall flying in all directions. "Fragmentation," Jake explained as they moved through the smoking breach. "High explosives wrapped in metal casing. When it goes off, the shrapnel tears through anything in the area." They fought their way into the nest level by level, each chamber presenting new horrors. The Kethmori defenders were larger and more aggressive than anything they had encountered in the forest, their armor plates thicker and their claws capable of shredding even powered battlesuits. But Jake's weapons continued to prove devastatingly effective. Each shot from his rifle dropped a creature that would have taken sustained fire from multiple energy weapons. His revolver, loaded with what he called hollow point rounds, created massive wound channels that stopped even the largest warriors instantly. "The bullets expand on impact," he explained during a brief lull in the fighting. "Creates a bigger hole going out than going in. Transfers all the energy to the target instead of passing through." Specialist Reth, his purple skin now streaked with alien ichor, watched in fascination as Jake reloaded his ancient weapons. "Your ammunition is designed to maximize tissue damage rather than armor penetration?" "Different loads for different jobs," Jake confirmed, snapping his revolver's cylinder shut. "Armor piercing for the hard targets, expanding bullets for the soft ones." They reached the Queen's chamber after 3 hours of brutal fighting. Half their force was wounded, and their ammunition supplies were running dangerously low. But Jake Morrison still stood, his weapons ready, his eyes calm despite the carnage they had witnessed. The chamber itself was vast, easily 100 meters across and twice that in height. Organic pods lined the walls, each one pulsing with developing young. And in the center, surrounded by the largest HFY warriors they had yet encountered, sat the queen. She was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Standing nearly 5 meters tall, her armored carapace was black as space and twice as thick as her children's. Her 6 arms ended in claws that could tear through starship hull plating, and her eyes held an intelligence that was disturbingly familiar. "Human," the queen spoke, her voice somehow bypassing their translation systems to resonate directly in their minds. "Your primitive weapons have cost me many children." Jake stepped forward, his rifle held ready but not quite aimed at the massive creature. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss, but your young ones were threatening innocent folks. Couldn't let that stand." The queen's laugh was like grinding metal. "Innocent? You speak of innocence while carrying weapons designed to end life efficiently?" "Sometimes ending one life saves many others," Jake replied calmly. "That's the burden folks like me carry." Around the chamber, dozens of warrior-caste HFY began to move, positioning themselves for a coordinated attack. The galactic troops raised their weapons, but everyone knew that this final battle would be won or lost by the old human with his ancient revolver. "Your weapons should not work," the queen continued, her mental voice filled with confusion and growing anger. "We have adapted to energy weapons, to plasma and particle beams and graviton manipulators, but your chemical propulsion devices—" "Sometimes the old ways are the best ways," Jake said, finally raising his rifle to his shoulder, "especially when the new ways stop working." The queen's roar shook dust from the chamber ceiling. "Kill them all," she commanded her warriors, "but bring me the human alive. I would learn the secrets of his primitive technology." What followed was the most chaotic battle any of the survivors would ever witness. Energy weapons blazed through the chamber as the galactic troops fought for their lives against overwhelming numbers. Claws clashed against force shields, and the air filled with the smell of ozone and alien blood. In the center of it all, Jake Morrison fought like a man possessed. His rifle spoke with its distinctive crack, each shot dropping a warrior that would have taken multiple energy blasts to stop. When the range closed too much for the long gun, he switched to his revolver, the heavy bullets punching through armor that had been evolved to stop everything the galaxy's military could throw at it. But there were too many of them. For every creature that fell, 2 more seemed to take its place. The old human's ammunition was running low, and the warriors were learning to attack from multiple angles simultaneously. That's when Jake reached for the final surprise in his arsenal. From his belt, he drew what looked like another antique grenade, but this one was different. Larger, heavier, with a longer fuse than the fragmentation devices he had been using. "White phosphorus," he announced to anyone still listening. "Burns through just about anything." The explosion that followed was like a piece of hell unleashed in the chamber. White-hot chemical fire spread across everything it touched, burning through armor that had shrugged off plasma bolts. The HFY warriors screamed in alien agony as the phosphorus ate through their protective shells like acid through paper. In the chaos and smoke, Jake found himself face to face with the queen herself. She loomed over him like a mountain of armored death, her claws raised to strike. The old human had 1 bullet left in his revolver, and he knew it had to count. "You cannot kill me with your primitive weapons," the queen hissed, her mental voice filled with absolute confidence. "My armor is too thick, my vital organs too protected." Jake smiled grimly and aimed not at her armored torso, but at the junction where her massive head met her neck. There, between the overlapping plates of chitin, was a gap no larger than his thumb. "Maybe," he said quietly. "But my grandfather always taught me that every suit of armor has a weak spot. You just have to know where to look." The final shot of the battle rang out like thunder, and the queen of the HFY collapsed like a falling mountain. Around the chamber, the surviving warriors stood frozen in shock as their leader's mental commands suddenly ceased. Without their queen's controlling influence, the creatures began to mill about aimlessly, their coordinated intelligence fragmenting into individual confusion. The galactic troops, amazed to find themselves still alive, quickly secured the chamber and began evacuating the wounded. Later, as the transport ship carried them away from Kepler 442b, the surviving soldiers gathered around Jake Morrison one final time. The old human was cleaning his weapons with the same meticulous care he had shown throughout the mission, his movements unhurried despite their recent victory. "Sir," Lieutenant Commander Thies said formally, "I want to personally recommend you for the Galactic Medal of Valor. Your actions today saved not only this mission, but possibly the lives of every person on this ship." Jake looked up from his rifle, surprise evident on his weathered face. "That's mighty kind of you, ma'am, but I was just doing my job." Sergeant Zexhai stepped forward, his four arms holding a small device that Jake recognized as a military recorder. "Sir, would you be willing to provide tactical instruction for our training programs? The galaxy needs to understand these principles of kinetic warfare." "Don't see why not," Jake replied, holstering his revolver. "Though I suspect your folks are smart enough to improve on what I've shown you here today." Corporal Venn, his scaled hide still showing the scars of battle, shook his head in amazement. "To think that we almost dismissed you because your weapons looked primitive." "Well," Jake said with a smile, "my grandfather always told me that it's not the size of the dog in the fight. It's the size of the fight in the dog. Same principle applies to weapons, I reckon." As the ship entered hyperspace for the journey home, the old human found himself surrounded by soldiers who had learned a valuable lesson about the difference between advanced and effective. Sometimes the best solution to a problem was the simplest one, and sometimes the most powerful weapon was the one that had been proven over centuries of use. Jake Morrison returned to Earth as something of a legend, though he never quite understood what all the fuss was about. To him, he had simply used the tools his grandfather had taught him to use, applied lessons learned over generations of human conflict to a new and alien battlefield. But across the galaxy, military academies began adding courses in kinetic warfare theory. Weapons manufacturers started developing new projectile systems based on ancient human designs. And somewhere in the files of Galactic Intelligence Services, a new entry appeared in their threat assessment databases. It simply read, "Never underestimate human ingenuity, especially when it comes to finding new ways to put holes in things that don't want holes in them." The old cowboy would have been proud.